So the question, why the Germans, why the Jews, it's not my title. It's the title of a very recent book by the maverick and always interesting German historian, Götz Ali. I'm going to tell you his answer just now, but the questions are obviously not new. Ever since this has become a topic of historical study, the thing that we call the Holocaust, or the Shoah, or the final solution, whatever the name we may give it, these are questions that have been asked from the beginning, continue to be asked, and this is your time to already leave the lecture if you believe that at the end I'm going to give you some kind of definitive answer. I'm not. The answers have been so numerous, so contradictory, sometimes richly deep, and sometimes so absurdly simplistic, that to conclude that one day we will finally know the answers, the ultimate answers, would simply be, I think, wrong-headed. But this doesn't relieve us of the responsibility, nevertheless, to probe as deeply as we can into these questions. And obviously, in a lecture of this kind, I will have to be selective in the examples that I'm going to give. First of all, what are we really talking about? What is the object of this exercise? It is what that famous and great Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski calls ideological genocide. One which, at least at the very decision-making top, conducted mass killings, not simply for self-enrichment, although that was also part of it, but which was grounded in a philosophy, insisting that the victims deserve annihilation for either metaphysical, moral, religious, or historical reasons. In the history of genocides, this is not always the case. The mass murder of the Armenians during World War I was supported by very slim ideological or worldview considerations. And the massacres of Indians in North America had hardly any ideological baggage. The European conquest of South America occasionally argued that the natives, unlike Christians, had no real soul. But that was not the reason for their mass killings. Most genocides have proceeded without the killers bothering to construct theories justifying their actions. Simple power, domination, land, possession, and wealth were the mainsprings. It's true, always, the otherness of the victims helped overcome inhibitions. But that was not the determining reason for the murders. Of course, in religious wars, there were ideological reasons. But at least in religious wars, heretics had the option to renounce their errors and convert to the proselytizing, conquering religion. The Nazi case was different. Extermination was to be total and an ideological duty. In putatively civilized mid-20th century Europe, justification was both necessary and at the very core of the project. And I will try to enumerate some of the more important attempts at trying to understand this. And of course, they are limited in their understanding. So we should begin by looking at some of the answers of why the Germans. Now, the very question assumes a kind of specifically collective mentality or a peculiarly national answer, a kind of essentialist anthropology or psychology, or a peculiar history that especially predisposed Germans and Germany towards Nazism and the killing of Jews. Early approaches and explanations can be variously characterized under the general umbrella term, the Sonderweg, the special path. That is to say that Germany had a peculiar history, a peculiarly pathological history, quite removed from the, let's say, quote unquote, normal, healthy, democratic, liberal West, Britain, France, and so on, and that from the people time it differently, went on the kind of wrong, aberrant path. And so, because of its special path, it could spawn such a monstrous outgrowth. Now, of course, in embryonic stereotypical forms, these ideas long predated the Holocaust. These ideas were already present in the late 19th century and in World War I. This was the image of Germans as intrinsically militaristic, authoritarian, obedient, rapacious, murderous, and block-headed. But it was only in the 1960s and after that the far more respectable, sophisticated versions of the Sonderweg appeared. These theories held that unlike in the West, the normal good West, Germany was characterized by a disjunction between great economic development on the one hand and backward social, political, and cultural developments on the other. So these argued really that unlike elsewhere, Germany never really underwent a bourgeois revolution that guaranteed liberal democratic regimes elsewhere. So the result of this, there is another variant, and that is, because of this, Germany developed a specifically regressive form of nationalism called folkish ideology, with its metaphysic of deep national rootedness, its symbolism of blood, soil, and will, its anti-urban, anti-liberal bias, its rejection of modernity, and a deep anti-Semitic view of the Jews as both symbolizing and embodying all these evils. And any number of works were written with titles like From Luther to Hitler, From the Romantics to Hitler, and so on and so on and so forth. Many of these ideas have by now been rejected. And there are obvious reasons for rejecting this approach. The first concerns what I call teleology, the temptation to read German history as an inevitable linear development which had to lead to what we now know happened. It's very easy for historians to portray the past as if it were merely the preparation, the prologue of what is to come later. Secondly, even if these things existed, and they did, the way in which things work is ideas are never literally mediated, transmitted. They're always mediated. They come into different contexts, and the influences are multiple. Thirdly, they reduce what historians really need to do, and to look at historical processes in terms of their contingency. Let me put it this way, let Peter Gabe, the late Peter Gabe, put it this way. To say that the Third Reich was grounded in the German past is true enough. To say that it was the inescapable result of that past, the only fruit that the German tree could grow, is false. 1933 was not inscribed in every past event of German history, tradition, culture, and politics, but it was inscribed in some. So there's the beginning where I'm not giving you an answer. What an easy escape I'm giving myself. But this leads me to an even more serious deficiency. To the degree that these theories have some power and validity, they do account, perhaps, for the breakdown of Weimar democracy, for the authoritarianism and the illiberalism, perhaps even for the exaggerated degree of anti-Semitism. But we are here trying to explain the most transgressive, unprecedented, cruel act, perhaps, I'm not one arguing for uniqueness, but a massively transgressive act So you need a different level of explanation to try and come to terms with the nature of this transgression. To say that it's simply the continuation of what happened is to leave out something crucial in explaining this development. So there has been one rather famous Sonderweg attempt to do this in the recent past, using the Sonderweg paradigm. I'm referring, of course, and many of you will have heard of it, to Daniel Goldhagen's 1996 work, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans and the Holocaust. This sees the Shoah as uniquely and exclusively through the prism of what he would call a unique German anti-Semitism, in which it's the almost inevitable unleashing of a long-brewing national project of the Germans, and has nothing to do with other explanations which bring in more universalist kinds of ideas. For Goldhagen, the final solution represents the logical outcome of a peculiarly lethal, singularly German, eliminationist anti-Semitism, deeply built into the country's political culture and its social and religious institutions. Already in the 19th century, he claims, the overwhelming majority of Germans had internalized this view, and with the rise of Hitler, eliminating the Jews seamlessly melded into its racist, exterminatory form. And the overwhelming majority of Germans, he says, thus either understood or willingly engaged in the killing of Jews, usually in the most cruel and humiliating ways possible. For Goldhagen, the Shoah reflected the authentic sentiments and the popular will of the majority of the German nation. But surely this is all too easy. The major issues and problems are simply dismissed. There is no doubt that anti-Semitism seriously disfigured and was clearly evident in 19th and 20th century Germany. That it was deeply bound, certainly as a necessary but not sufficient condition, with the decision to exterminate the Jews, that's common point. But anti-Semitism was not a majestically autonomous, disembodied force. Jew hatred clearly existed, but at issue is the question of its relative weight as a causal agent amidst a whole welter of other exclusions, prejudices, forces, and factors that brought about the Holocaust. If the continuity of Jew hatred is a crucial factor, one needs of German Jewish hatred, then one needs to explain the fact that 19th and early 20th century anti-Semitism was far stronger, certainly in Eastern Europe, and as my teacher George Mossop used to say time and time again, if you asked somebody at the end of the 19th century or early 20th century, where in the 20th century will the Holocaust take place? From a Western or Central European country, the answer would be France, not Germany. So, if popular anti-Semitism was so deeply ingrained in Germany, why were the Nazis constrained to mute their anti-Jewish rhetoric from 1929 to 1933? Indeed, we know that for many people who joined the Nazi Party, anti-Semitism was the result of becoming a Nazi, not the cause of its attraction. So it's more complicated. So if it was such a popular movement, if it was so seamless, then why on earth was the Endlösung, the final solution, always in quotes, why was it supposed to be kept secret? The signals and the reality, especially for German Jews, was far more mixed and complex than that. If the hate was so great, how does one explain the enormous intermarriage rate between Jews and non-Jews in the Weimar Republic, going up and up all the time? So there's a mixture of, on the one hand, integration, and on the other hand, hostility. And it's precisely this complicated ambivalence that proved to be a trap for many German Jews when the Nazis came to power. The almost inability to believe that in this cultured nation something like this was occurring. So in many ways, Goldhagen's views have not been predominant. Rather, it's been with other British historians, such as Ian Kershaw, who argued that certainly latent anti-Semitism was there, but it was more latent, and the major attitudes were apathy, passivity, and indifference. By the way, those attitudes of passivity and indifference usually is true with regard to the behavior of people towards minority outsiders, especially in crisis situations. That's clear. So it was this, much more, this passivity and indifference, much more than active popular hatred, that allowed the ideological elite to propel and radicalize anti-Jewish policy into genocide. Nevertheless, more recent Sonderweg attempts to answer the question why the Germans, why the Jews, no longer speak about ideology, but much more about emotions, emotional bases. Thus, Goetz Ali, from whose book I take the title of this book, he relates the development of a specifically German anti-Semitism to the astonishing and rapid economic, political, and cultural success of German Jews. In other words, the Holocaust for Goetz Ali is essentially the result of Christian envy for German Jewish success. The key, he argues, is simply envies. I quote, "Christians became obsessed with how quickly the Jews were bettering themselves at their expense." And how does he do this? He says, well, Germany was a divided polity, and more than anywhere else, it was characterized by a deep and ongoing collective insecurity, leading to an ever more insistence on an exaggerated sense of national identity. Jews were seen to be more successful, wealthy, and intelligent, and so race hatred came in order to rationalize the envy and allow, if you like, Germans, their national community, and also to take Jewish property, and in the end, make the persecution of the Jews far easier than it was before. This too, in my opinion, there's some truth to it. Envy is not a nice emotion. Who of us have not experienced envy? Probably no one in Ireland does, but most people do. It's too simple. Now, I may be jealous of my ethnically different neighbor's garden and his motor car, but that is really not sufficient cause, usually, for me to kill him, and certainly not a cause for me to kill all those who happen to be associated with him in the entire world. So there's something deeply missing in this argument. Given the continental-wide scale of genocide, jealousy and envy can hardly be said to be the ways in which the vast majority of the victims, the masses of East European Jewry, were seen. Eastern European Jews were not the envy of German Christians. They were stereotypically regarded as primitive carriers of dirt and disease, distasteful creatures of the ghetto, reviled, not envied, perhaps sources of fear, but certainly not envied. Envy also hardly accounts for the still enormously difficult to grasp genocidal obsession that moved Nazi murderers, even very late in the war, to travel to remote Greek islands and search out little babies and little children. And I'll return to this a little later. So envy, too, as a specifically German characteristic, isn't at all persuasive. And I want to move on, because there are those who say the Germans are the explanation, and there are those too on the other side who say, no, we have to seek far more universalist, general, human kinds of explanation for that transgressive event. So, and of course, the human factor, which is not to deny anti-Semitism, but to place anti-Semitism in a different context. The argument here is that the Holocaust was a chillingly human possibility. They imply that all of us in similar circumstances may well have become perpetrators. These theories, too, operate at various levels. Now, how do you talk about this event, which historians are putting together? Those who were involved in it didn't experience it as one event. We as historians come after and are imposing on it a single kind of structure. But there were various levels. There are the elite decision makers. There are the bureaucrats. There are the onlookers. There are the bystanders. There are those down to the individual killers. In fact, there is a new movie called Son of Saul, which is about the Sonderkommandos, in which the killers weren't Germans at all, but which were the victims themselves. So the thing is deeply convoluted and complex. Now you have these non-Sonderweg, these non-German answers coming from various people, German conservatives, Marxist thinkers, or German Jewish emigres, and each had a different line. For instance, conservative German historians such as Gerhard Ritter and Friedrich Meinecke, their explanation was national, they remained German, but they disavowed any notion that Germany was an abnormally developed country. For them, Nazism was the result of the importation of alien imports from the West, bringing in mass democracy, bringing in a kind of cheapening and dulling of the masses. So in a sense, Germany was normal and developed. It's the demeaning West that has created the problem. I won't go into this in any detail. So it was modernity for them, not German history, which was the result. For most Marxists, Nazism was really just a kind of fascism and had nothing to do with German national character, but with the explanation was capitalism under pressure. Neither of these approaches gave much weight to anti-Semitism or the genocide of the Jews. When it was discussed by the conservative historians, the Jews were seen still after the Holocaust as agents of instability. And a Marxist, Franz Neumann, a Jewish Marxist, wrote in 1942, from a Marxist point of view, the internal political value of anti-Semitism will never allow for a complete extermination of the Jews. They're too useful as scapegoats for Nazi ideology. So, way out. But there was one German Jewish emigre whose name was Hannah Arendt, who gave a very different kind of answer. She also rejected any reference to specifically German developments, but she did take anti-Semitism and the exterminations very seriously. For her, let me just put it this way. She dismissed German explanations, and for her too, it was the uprooting dynamics of modern society as such, which tended towards nihilism and superfluity that provided the key. Her classic work, and it's an amazing work, full of mistakes, full of historical errors, kind of crazy, and yet deeply insightful, called The Origins of Totalitarianism. It's almost totally devoid of any reflections on the German mind or the German culture or German politics. For her, Nazism was conceived as one extreme instance of a general, radically novel, peculiarly modern political project of total domination called totalitarianism. Its genesis was not bound to any particular historical culture. It incarnated a potential latent in the 20th century itself. Its deadliness derived not from its nationality, but its generality. Indeed, she insisted, I quote, Nazism is actually the breakdown of all German traditions, the good as well as the bad. Even more critically, in 1945, she completely exonerated German culture. I quote, Luther, Kant, Hegel, or Nietzsche have not the least responsibility for what is happening in the extermination camps, unquote. So she argued continuity could not account for the emergence of an entirely new genocidal mentality. Rather, it was the breakdown of older stabilizing frameworks, the emergence of radical new structures, and unprecedented imperialist expansionary drives, the transgressive urge to go beyond all previous limits and to render everything possible that constituted the key. You needed a new explanation for something that transcended the boundaries of conventional understanding. That's the Arendtian mode. She also disclaimed discontinuity when it came to anti-Semitism. Those who rely on the notion of an eternal Jew hatred, she argued, are at a loss to explain the unprecedented nature of this event. If it's there all the time, why did it only occur once and at this particular time? So for those who go on about eternal things, that's no explanation at all. On the other hand, though, she spent considerable time analyzing anti-Semitism and put it at the very storm center of world politics and the Nazi drive to total domination. I won't go into her controversial analysis of anti-Semitism. We can do that later. It's a very problematic notion. What I want to stress here, though, is that she had no doubt that it was at the storm center. As many of you know, much of her analysis of anti-Semitism, it almost makes the Jews responsible for it. Jews are allied with the elites of states in terms of money and power. And then, of course, there is the famous Eichmann in Jerusalem work, where much of the blame is placed on the leaders of the Jewish councils. If we want to and go into the discussion, we can do that, but let's go on. What remains for us in this discussion is she always insisted on formulating these things in more general frameworks and universal categories. She insisted that Jew hatred was a necessary, but not a sufficient condition for genocide. I quote, neither the fate of European Jewry nor the establishment of death factories can be fully explained and grasped in terms just of anti-Semitism. There was an inner logic, a dynamic to the extermination drive itself. That's a hard thought. It's hard to get there. That in the drive to extermination, there's some mechanism that's pushing it on, which is independent, in a way, of the victims. It's a crazy idea. Quite unlike Goldhagen, she refused to portray these extreme events in terms of a simple dichotomy between wildly anti-Semitic German killers and Jewish victims. She was sure that it went beyond anthropological national distinctions and claimed, and I believe this to be true, that the Holocaust raises explanatory and moral issues of universal concern. I just want to say, though, this is not in the lecture. Beware of people who are giving you the lessons of the Holocaust. I'm not a lesson giver. You know, with spots coming on. It was such an extreme event, so beyond our normal categories of experience, that it's not possible simply to extract a simple lesson for ourselves. It's beyond that. Anyway, Arendt would have been appalled by the Goldhagen's later advice that this, I quote Goldhagen, the study of Germans and their anti-Semitism before and during the Nazi period must be approached as an anthropologist would a previously unencountered pre-literate people and their beliefs, leaving behind especially the preconception that Germans were in every realm just like our ideal notion of ourselves. So you need a different set, like an anthropologist. Go and see this pre-literate tribe called the Germans. But the shock that we still experience with regard to those events is the exact opposite of Goldhagen's statement. It doesn't do us much credit, but we are somehow less taken aback, less shocked by the barbarism of pre-literate peoples. It is precisely the fact that the Holocaust was carried out by one of the most literate societies in the world, not pre-literate. Indeed, many members of the Einsatzgruppen, those people who went around shooting and killing, possessed doctorates and were primarily students of law and the humanities. Take that in. That constitutes our shocked outrage. And I think the huge literature, which keeps on pouring out, our concern, our ruminations, flows to a great degree from our Eurocentric beliefs that this was an event in which cultured perpetrators killed cultured victims. And that's deeply part of our concern. I have a feeling there's a kind of geography of empathy. And even the killings in Europe, on the borders of Europe, Russia, seem to have less emotional impact on us. And the further you go into Asia and Africa, those things pale. That's not to our credit. But that's, I think, has to do with a certain geography of empathy and our shock of cultured nations, in quotes, killing cultured victims. So, basically, what I'm trying to say is you have here two schools of thought, those that stress the German notions and those that stress more universal kinds of ideas, such as modernity, bureaucracy, banality of evil, obedience to authority, and so on, and so on. Those who seek to widen our understanding and call it as a human possibility stress that this event was not only carried out by Germans, but by people in almost every European country under German occupation. Indeed, in some cases, such as France, the authorities initiated the expulsion of foreign Jews before any German or Nazi order was issued. Even more generally, I'm no longer just talking about the fact of the Holocaust. I'm talking about human killings. Before the Holocaust, commenting on the Spanish Civil War, this is what Simone Weil wrote about participants even on the left. Participants even on the left, none of the participants expressed repugnance or even only disapproval of unnecessary bloodshed. Men would relate with a warm, comradely smile how they had killed priests or fascists. Whenever a certain group of human beings is relegated by some authority beyond the pale of those whose life has a price, then one finds it perfectly natural to kill people. When one knows that one can kill without risk or punishment or blame, one kills, or or smiles encouragingly at those who kill. If one happens to feel some revulsion, one hides it, one stifles it, fearing to be seen lacking in virility. This is all a quote. There seems to be some impulse of intoxication, which is impossible to resist. I, that's Simone Weil, have not found it in anyone. On the contrary, I have seen sober Frenchmen who on their own accord would never have thought of killing anyone, plunging with obvious relish into that blood-soaked atmosphere. So the disturbing effect of these human, if you like, studies emphasize that emphasize either non-German or local or more universal springs of murder is to argue that for those who operated the machinery of destruction, from the decision makers to desk murderers to officers down to the ordinary men and women who did the dirty work at the lowest part of the hierarchy, they could do so out of a variety of motives, of which anti-Semitism was always either latently or explicitly present, but which was not the only one and not necessarily always the most crucial one. I won't go into this. Of course, the most famous example of this is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, not Ordinary Germans, which brings in all those factors: social pressure, obedience to authority, alcoholism, routinization, deference to authority, all of these things going on, including pure careerism. And once you've started a job, he writes, there is the predilection simply to complete, to finish off a job, a task, a duty, once that is undertaken. Now, there's no doubt here that anti-Semitism plays a role, and a crucial role. Jews, after all, stood outside the circle of obligation and responsibility. There has to be some kind of process by which they are excluded, dehumanized, pushed out. But anti-Semitism operated in a complex cluster of additional dehumanizing processes that ultimately facilitated such actions. Of course, the Holocaust was an anti-Jewish project, but it could be carried out precisely because its murderous impulses operated within an ever-brutalizing war. You can have the Holocaust because there is a war. It can't exist outside of it. Germany is occupying Europe. A dehumanizing atmosphere, killing going on all over, refugees, chaos. And so you have particular local and political contexts and modes of behavior that render it a human possibility. Browning writes, not trying to understand the perpetrators in human terms would make impossible any history of Holocaust perpetrators that seeks to go beyond one-dimensional caricature. Ultimately, the Holocaust took place because at the most basic level, individual human beings killed other human beings. Nor can anti-Semitism, and this comes from a very controversial book, most of which I disagree with, so I'm just going to quote the things I do agree with. Timothy Snyder's new book, Black Earth, where it's all about ecology, and leave that aside, we won't talk about that. But he is quite right when he says anti-Semitism cannot fully explain the behavior of members of the Einsatzgruppen who were sent into Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 and killed all kinds of people, but didn't kill Jews at that time. The Einsatzgruppen sent into Poland in 1939, at the beginning, killed more Poles than they did Jews at the very beginning. Even the Einsatzgruppen sent into the USSR killed others besides Jews, the disabled, gypsies, communists, and in some regions, Poles. There were very few Germans whose only task was to kill Jews. Again, the people who killed people killed people. And we forget too that many of the killers were not Nazis or even Germans. You have to go through these countries and see there are all kinds of attitudes mixed with anti-Semitism, careerism, enrichment, political circumstances that encourage killers from almost all these countries to participate in this bloodbath. The politics of mass killing was really a joint creation, a meeting of all these nationalities, especially under the Soviet yoke, combined with Nazi expectations. Now, all of this being said, I'm coming to the end. There is an end to this. The nightmare will end, I promise. None of these factors were really responsible for orchestrating the final solution. They don't tell us much about the underlying motivating factors, the level of ideology and policy making at the very top, the driving force of a small elite that set these events in motion and which made the very idea of killing all Jews thinkable, conceivable in the first place. That's the issue. How do you get to an idea, we're going to kill all the Jews? Very hard to get your mind around that. But somewhere along the line, no matter how functionalist you are, you have to get to that level of question. This has been always the blind spot of what is known as the functionalist school, which stresses the polycratic nature of the regime and its largely non-ideological groping towards the killing. But by and large, they really only pay lip service to the broader background, the larger context and mental structure that shaped the choices made, guided the action, and created the atmosphere in which decisions proceeded and which permitted radical, previously tabooed atrocities. What, in other words, rendered this entire project thinkable, a possibility? That must be regarded as the decisive level of analysis. There is virtual consensus today about the centrality of Hitler's obsessional and demonic view of the Jews as the animating force. This, of course, fitted into a wider picture he had of the world, an overall racial outlook, an anti-liberal, anti-rationalist view of existence as eternal racial struggle requiring Lebensraum, living room, the conquering of the East for its food and resources, and ruthlessly subjugating and enslaving its peoples. But as far as the Jews were concerned, they represented a kind of wound of nature, an essentially anti-natural force. For Hitler, their total extermination was ultimately necessary to save the planet. For the Jews, with their abstract, rational, and ethical insistencies, were a kind of anti-race, disturbing the natural racial order, a threat to the nature and the struggle for racial domination and superiority. Now, this is where I should start the lecture. Do you have another 3 hours? Where did this come from? How does he and this elite concoct this ideology? It doesn't just come from nowhere. And that is what I want to just spend the last few minutes dealing with. There are longer term and necessary building blocks that went into this, and that were to be found in many strands of 19th century and early 20th century European and German high and popular culture and political practice. This informing background may at least partially help us to understand not only how such murderous conclusions could be reached, but also how and why such a worldview could become accepted, or at least plausible and not resisted, to millions of people. I can't enumerate all the factors, so I'm going to do it telegraphically. What were these new building blocks? Social Darwinism, and its related ideas of struggle, degeneration, and regeneration. Purest stereotypes of health and disease, beauty and ugliness, normalcy and the abnormal. The ruthless, often genocidal cultures of colonialism and imperial domination. The emergence of a kind of life philosophy with its affirmation of euthanasia for those deemed unworthy of life. Transgressive Nietzschean insistences that everything is permitted and there is an imperative to go beyond all limits. The rise of varieties of racism, the science of eugenics, the breakdown of the bourgeois civilized order in World War I and its catastrophic aftermath in Weimar, the cult and practice of violence as not only a necessary but a redemptive act, and the accompanying idea of the creation of a new, radical new man or woman and a new society, and of course, anti-Semitism in all its guises. That's a mouthful. But this comes from somewhere. And if you don't get to that cultural background, I don't think you get very far. This does not mean to say it was inevitable. It's how you put these things together and what conclusions you draw that makes this come about. So it's the elite, the decision makers, the officers. They forge these elements into an ever increasingly radicalized, overarching project. That is the enabling context in which traditional Jew hatred is transformed into total genocide. The Jews certainly were its most hated and ultimate victim. Only they were targeted for total extermination. But that operation occurred within a general eugenic framework of German so-called renewal and resettlement, with exclusionary measures that included mass sterilization and the killing and gassing of Germany's sick and insane, the mass murder of gypsies, the virtual extermination of the Polish intelligentsia, the persecution and killing of various homosexuals, and between 1941 and 1944, the death of 7 million civilians in Russia. It's not the autonomous strength of Jew hatred that has impelled it to assume its entirely novel, systematically genocidal apotheosis, but rather its integration under conditions of total war within a radically transgressive vision of Aryan mastery, racial servitude, and destruction. That was the extreme ultimate edge. Just 2 more pages. It's heavy stuff. I think what happened here is, as a result, a kind of new sort of destructive politics, a new knowledge of the capacity for mass murder came about. The most distinguished, I think, still Holocaust scholar, the earliest pioneer, Raoul Hilberg, in a very unknown article, which he probably would disavow now, he's no longer with us, wrote the following: blood was to be shed. This act, this work, was never to be undone. A landmark in history, it was cast in monumental proportions. This was no episode, it was a deed. In the middle, a final cognition was felt. The perpetrator was gazing upon a forbidden vista. Under the murky huts of Auschwitz, these guards were living through something ultimate. Experience, erlebnis, was reaching its outer limits. The act had become knowledge, and that knowledge was unique, for the sensation of a first discovery is not repeatable. Maybe it's less abstract from what Saul Friedlander has put it. He never underplays the role of anti-Semitism, so don't get me wrong. But he described it, the staggering dimension of the mass murders were also facilitated by a quite non-ideological, intoxicated state of mind. The perpetrators, he writes, I quote, were seized by a compelling lust for killing on an immense scale, driven by some kind of extraordinary elation in repeating the killing of ever greater masses of people. Now, as far as historians can go, that's about the limit, I think, of what historians can go. I do not believe, as so many say, that this was an event that occurred on another planet, and that it's beyond history, and it's a metaphysical thing. But I do think you can go so far, and then you hit a limit, which doesn't mean you can evade the responsibility to proceed ever further. But, and I don't believe either that claims to its uniqueness get us very far. In fact, you can really understand it by comparative analysis, which, by the way, your own Alan Kramer has done especially well. That's how you get to what is exceptional and specific, by comparing it to something else. I will pause here and just say, when somebody asked my wife, how is your husband? She said, compared to whom? So I think we do arrive at a kind of deeper understanding of how, but the why is still deeply problematic. And I'll tell you where I do stop and kind of find a limit to the possibilities of explanation. I will conclude with that. If there is a black box of inexplicability, it is surely trying to understand what motivated the Nazis as late as June 1944 to deport 2,200 Jews of all ages from the remote island of Rhodes over a distance of 2,000 kilometers to Auschwitz, certainly at a certain cost also to their failing military effort. But above all, and here may be my sentimentality, it is the mass killing of babies that threatens my powers of comprehension. 2 days after his famous speech on October 4th, 1943, in which Himmler told SS leaders that we have the moral right and duty to kill these people who wanted to kill us, he told an assembly of Gauleiters and high-ranking Nazi officials that killing only the Jewish men was not sufficient. If the women and their offspring were not murdered, future generations of Jewish children would arise and avenge themselves on our sons and grandsons. That's how the leadership saw it. But some perpetrators in the field constructed even more mind-blowing rationalizations. As one killer later reported, without noting the irony of his so-called compassion, I quote, I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers. Whatever the twisted reason, it is the compulsive hunting drive, the peeking into little corners, the great urgency and often pride in the catch of the most vulnerable that remains so shockingly difficult to explain. Perhaps the sly, determined, obsessional hunting, even a kind of instinct, can't be betrayed anymore by the historians. Maybe you need to turn to fiction, to novels, to drama, to film. In fact, the best portrait that I've ever seen of this is in an entirely fictional scene from, of all people, that Hollywood creation, Quentin Tarantino, in The Inglourious Basterds, where the first scene shows Christopher Waltz in the most civilized form, tapping out children hidden under the wooden floors. So I think at that level, it is only in non-historical way that we can get to levels of humanity and inhumanity that logical and rational categories of explanation simply cannot reach. Thank you.